If you need help, I think.
Hello, testing, testing. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you.
Ay, ponemos los libros. Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good evening. Apologies for this eventful beginning. We are too anxious, in my case, because I am a big fan of Carmen Maria Machado and she's exhausted. She's been working all day. Welcome to this chat in this 42 festival. It's an honor to me to be able to moderate this chat with Carmen, because as you know, well, you're here for her. She's one of the most interesting voices that we see in contemporary literature, written by women. I know that these labels are not very agreeable, but her literature is in her literature is very important and very prominent. The female figure, the female character, and the how the character is transversed by all genders. Of course, I don't want to take up her time because we're here to listen to her, but let me briefly introduce that she has authored two very interesting books, Her Body and Other Parties and In the Dream House. The first one is a short story book, and the second one is a novel, but could be, well, it has a very complex structure. Rather than a very complex one that makes it closer to other narrative models. And since we are in a genre festival, she has a very rich literature in terms of narrative and topics. I think it's interesting for us to discuss her books and her literature from the angle of these genres. In these two books, there's constantly horror, fantasy, and even more abstract whimsies, close to thriller. I was talking with her. There is a cinema-like approach to her proposals. So to try and focus on this matter, because it's the topic of the festival, I'd like to start by asking her, which is your relationship with pure genres, with horror, with fantasy? Does that come from there as a reader? Maybe that has been an inspiration from day one. Or how have you approached these two genres?
So when I was a very small child, I was very into these books. I don't know, I'm sure they were translated, Goosebumps, R.L. Stein, yeah. And they were very scary, and I was very scared because I was a big scaredy cat. I was very anxious, even as a very small child. And I would read these books, and I'd read other, like Christopher Pike, like all these sort of books for, like horror books for children or for young people. And I would be up all night, like awake and shaking, and I wouldn't let my mother turn off the lights. And then she found them and she was like, "What is this? Like, what have you been reading?" And she would take them away from me and would forbid me from reading them, and I would simply return to them. I would get more from the library, or I would, go get them from a friend. And so even from the beginning, I was really interested in work that provoked me and that sort of changed my temperature, that created in me a sense of even deeper anxiety, which is sort of counterintuitive, I guess. But yeah, and then I was reading a lot of, Ray Bradbury and a lot of science fiction, a lot of fantasy. Like that was just the literature of my childhood. But horror particularly was one that I returned to over and over again.
Y cuando empiezas. And when you started writing, you start with stories, right? You thought, I have a series of stories and I will tell them through different genres, or you want to tell stories from genres?
Well, the first book was sort of a strange experience because, I went to graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and when I first got there, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I was sort of writing, these stories that were just not, they weren't me. I was writing, like a woman's father died, and she goes to his funeral. And it was just very boring. It wasn't very interesting. I mean, that's a perfectly fine plot for a story. It's a good plot. But I remember someone saying to me, "You are not interested by what you're writing." Like a classmate was like, "You are bored by your own story." And I remember in that story there was a moment where death appears to her, and he was like, the only moment this story came alive is when death, literally death, appears. It's the moment where you seem suddenly very interested in your own writing. And after that, I really began to read, I started reading Shirley Jackson and Angela Carter and all of these, Kelly Link and Karen Russell and all of these writers whose work spoke to this sensibility of sort of horror and fantasy and all this, and also a lot of genre play, like Helen Oyeyemi, folk tales, things that sort of blurred these lines. And so once I began to write after that, I was in this new sort of mode, I guess. And so everything that I wrote sort of was coming from my sort of obsession with these genres. So I was really interested in, television as a genre, or binge watching television shows, which is, I have a story in there about Law and Order, and I was really interested in the urban legend of the girl, the one with the ribbon around her neck, and so then I wrote that story. So it was sort of each one was a story I wanted to deconstruct, and I think I often approach stories like right now. The other day I was like, I really want to write a demonic possession story. I don't know what that looks like. I haven't figured it out yet, but it's just a type of story that I find myself coming to, just I like watching. I'm really interested in exorcism movies and movies about demons. And so I was like, I feel like I should, try that. So it's a lot of I wonder what would happen if I did that, is sort of my approach.
Es que de hecho una de las cosas.
Well, one of the most striking things about your books is that even if there is this play with genres, and it's playful and it's fun, and fun not as in funny, but it's fun to read, but there's always reality. There's always a reality basis, and that's very difficult to achieve, right? To use all these genre codes to build a story, but at the same time never lose sight of what you are telling, and the form should not become a mere play, and you have to tell a story. So I'd like to know how you work on this. I think it must be very difficult, because you can go towards one end, you tell a story and you put some frills on it of terror, of horror or fantasy, or you end up having an experiment with a watered down story. How do you work?
So it's a really good question, and I think is one that a lot of writers who are interested in genre face this question, right? And so, I mean, for me, because I'm often starting from a genre place or a place of form, like a formal experiment, this is the thing that I have to worry about, right? Because it's not enough to say, I'm going to write a demonic possession story. That's just one step in many steps of a story. And usually for me, there's a process of uncovering that happens when I'm writing. And so, for example, when I was writing, I actually don't even know what the Spanish translation is, but for the title, but the Law and Order story, started from a place of me thinking, is it possible to write an entire story using fictional synopses of fake Law and Order episodes that I've invented in my brain? Sure, I could probably do that, right? No one will stop me. And in the beginning, I didn't have an agenda. Or not an agenda, but I didn't have a sense of what the sort of the realness was underneath. But as I began to write, I began thinking about, what does it mean that, we binge watch these shows in which women's bodies are are having violence committed against them. What does it mean that you can sort of watch? I mean, I feel like anyone who watches an episode of Law and Order SVU, it's just it's like having a stroke, watching that show, because it's just horrible things. The other day I was chopping, I was making dinner, and my wife came in, and it was just this awful scenario playing out, and I was just chopping vegetables, and I feel that disconnect. So as I began writing it, I was thinking in this interested way about this question, and pretty soon that sort of infused and occupied the entire story. So for me, that's just my process. I mean, it just is sort of backwards. Occasionally, it happens in reverse, but usually it starts from the form place. But I always get to the meat of it or like the heart of it. And if I don't, then the story doesn't work. Like I have stories that I like, but they're not doing precisely what I want them because they're more play, less meat, I guess. And so I try. But for me, the stories that like I wanted to put in that book, the stories that felt like that were doing something that I felt like it belonged in the collection, are stories that, have this genre play, this formal play, and then also have, this sense of the horror of reality, right, sort of underneath it.
Hay una cosa,
You have mentioned the word body. And there's something I really love about your books, and it's the two wonderful titles, because they summarize very well your work, your literature. And there are 1,000 important topics and interesting things about your books, but there are two that obsess me, because I'm very close to sci-fi and horror. One is the body in itself, and of course the title is Her Body and Other Parties. And the other one is the house, this idea of a place where things happen that can alter the behavior of those who inhabit the house, that can go back to the past, that can be modified over time. So these are two very interesting topics. And I'd like to start with the body, because I think that you achieve to talk about the body in a very specific manner. Somebody attacks someone. That's a recurring idea in your literature, this attack. But you talk about how ourselves, we damage our bodies, we punish our bodies because we react to a hostile environment. So I'd like to know how you work on this notion of the body in your books. And we can move on to the house later, if you agree.
Yeah, I mean, the body to me, I mean, certainly, I mean, in that way, when let me finish the sentence. So I think when a first book comes out, you can sort of see what has been occupying a writer's brain for like their whole life, right? You can tell, this is the thing. And so I think in my first book, what you're seeing is me responding to my presence in the world in a sort of series of axes, I guess. So it's me as a fat woman, me as a queer woman, me as a woman, and the ways in which the body becomes forfeit, and the way in which the body exists on the threshold or in the liminal space, like it exists in this nowhere place. So I think for me, like that was my obsession. And sometimes you can see it playing out, like I'm having these like very active conversations with myself about, what does something mean? I mean, the story 8 Bites in the collection, which is the story that I wanted to write, where I was thinking a lot about. And that's a story that came from an idea where I had read this memoir about a woman who'd had a gastric bypass surgery. And she mentions it offhand in this memoir that she had lost the weight of an entire person. And I was like, interesting. And then I was thinking about the idea of writing about fatness and thinking about fatness in this sort of critical way. And so I ended up, and diet culture and things like that. And so I ended up writing a short story about a woman who gets gastric bypass surgery and then is haunted by the spirit of this body that she lost. This thing is like dragging itself through her house and like leaving her presence and haunting her. And so for me, like that is, and the story is literally, I mean, it ends with, and so I'm going to spoil it, sorry, but the story ends with, her, I mean, she beats it, like she hates it, and she treats it so horribly, and then at the end, many years into her future, she dies, and the thing that comes to take her away is this creature, is this body, and she says, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. And so that is quite literally a story about how we like reject and push the body away, this sort of gentle animal that like takes care of us and like ages and like does all kinds of horrible, I mean, having a body is a nightmare, so it does these horrible things, but also this thing that like carries around our ungrateful brains and will until we die, and there's something about that I just found so poignant, but I had to sort of arrive at that idea through the story itself. So for me, the body was just like, I mean, it's just this central lens through which I was sort of exploring. And again, I wrote this book from between when I was 20, 3 and 28, I guess. So it was just like that was the thing that was sort of occupying my mind at that time, and that was yeah.
But it's wonderful, your ability to turn the idea into a visual image that is literary. This idea of being a person that you leave behind after the surgery that undergoes the main character of this story. And I'm really surprised by this ability of yours. When we discussed before, I told you about this cinema flavor of your books. And this has to do with the idea of being able to turn very abstract things, complex emotions into powerful images. And that short story, 8 Bites, I think it's been translated as Ocho Bocados. It's very interesting in there, this ability of yours to turn notions into shocking images.
Yeah, it's so funny. Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever quite said it that way. But yeah, I think that idea of, genre play has this ability to sort of literalize the metaphor, right? So the metaphor becomes physical. It becomes something you can really hold on to. This is a book that I read when I was in high school that I really loved was like Water for Chocolate. And I remember reading it and just being like, oh, she's sad, so the tears are in the food, and being just amazed at how like it was just taking this idea that was like very abstract, this guilt or grief and sadness and heartbreak, and like turning it into this like literal sort of magical device. And I just always found that really interesting and just really provocative. And I think it's just something that I've just really, that I really enjoy doing and sort of thinking about. And I feel like it's so funny, I'm a teacher and I talk to my students a lot about metaphor, like what does it mean to have metaphor in your writing? Because I think students get really hooked on this idea where they're like, oh, this symbolizes this. It's like one-to-one. It's like you read a book, there's a secret message you have to sort of get out of like an object in the book, and that's how you understand it. But it's like things mean other things, and that I feel like that idea of sort of metaphor is so beautiful and like exists in our real lives as well. Like you don't just make it up for fiction. Like it's real. And so I don't know, for me, that idea of like literalizing the metaphor, like taking this idea, this abstract concept, and sort of like making it physical is like, I don't know, I feel like that's just like what being a writer also is like taking from the atmosphere all these ideas and like putting them into something that's like very concrete and specific.
The other question I had was about houses, about spaces. Once the novel has been entitled like that, in the Dream House, I think that this is very present in many of your stories, this idea of a place where things have happened that will alter the behavior of the inhabitants, that will condition the life of those who end up there. It has to do with horror and with Shirley Jackson, right? This idea of a woman wandering through a house where things have happened, where there is a past story that is still present in actual time. I'd like to ask you about the physical space. I think it's very important in your stories.
Yeah, I think in some ways the ideas of the body and the house they're related to each other. I think, I'm really interested in hauntings in general, and you can haunt a person can be haunted, right? And also a space can be haunted, or we talk about a space being haunted. And so in many ways, they're sort of functioning together, I think. The domestic, the idea of like a physical space sort of catching history and memory and like being infused with emotion. It's so funny because I don't really believe in ghosts. I was very religious as a teenager, and so I think a lot of that too is this idea that there is like something else that like if you could just like move the curtain to the side, you could see something, that there's a physicality to. I really believed that like there were angels, that's a very specific thing, or to believe that there. And so I think that part of it too is this idea that like space, like there are ideas and feelings can sort of occupy space. People occupy space, like we can be haunted, like people can haunt houses, houses can be haunted, people can be haunted by what haunts the houses, like all these ideas are kind of folding in on each other. And I don't know, it's always been really interesting to me. I mean, I love a haunted house story. I mean, so much of, you mentioned Shirley Jackson, like obviously like the haunted house and the Gothic as a genre is like one of a woman in a hostile space. And it's like, is she the ghost? Are there other ghosts? Like, is the ghost her? Like, what is that's always the question that's sort of being like churned over in those sorts of books. And I just find that really interesting, especially when you compare it to like the domestic. Like we talk about like the domestic being like the sphere of women, but then also we have this entire genre that is like the hostility of a house to a woman, Absolutely. Right? And so it's like just this like really beautiful sort of like a moving metaphor that is just like so rich and just feels like endlessly adaptable. I mean, I never get tired of haunted house stories. So I just feel like there's so much in there, and and as I was writing the memoir, like what became clear to me was like I was writing a kind of a haunted house story, and like I had to sort of grapple directly with that metaphor, with that idea.
Me gusta mucho eso que has comentado porque
I really like what you mentioned. I've always loved Shirley Jackson, but I had never interpreted her work as in the idea of a woman trapped in a house that is haunted as a metaphor of the woman trapped in the home, in which ghosts are projections of what she is going through. It's a nice coincidence because Mariana Enriquez mentioned this to me recently when she thought about Shirley Jackson. She thought about this idea of the woman in the house at home in a closed space, and she is doomed in a way, and all presences, all those ghosts are her ghosts. It's the impossibility of getting out, of living and feeling oppressed by the space itself.
Yeah, The Haunting of Hill House is my very favorite novel of all time. It is, if you have not read it, you should. It is a perfect novel. It is very scary and very upsetting and beautiful and perfect. But the thing about that book is it is ultimately about a woman who cannot escape her own loneliness. I mean, so it's not even about like it's domestic in the sense, the protagonist, Eleanor, her mother has just died. She's basically spent her 20s like taking care of her dying mother. Mm-hmm. And then her mother dies and suddenly she doesn't know what to do with herself, right? And and she goes to this supposedly haunted house to participate in this experiment, and which just sort of brings her to this terrifying, supposedly haunted mansion. And the thing about that book that's so interesting is ultimately the question of, is the house haunted in the strictest sense, is never really answered. Like, we don't know. We don't ever see anything that is like, irrefutably a ghost. But we're so deep in her point of view. We are so, and like in her just crushing loneliness. Like, she is somebody who is trying desperately to connect with other people and does not know how to do it. And like, I think there's a very good argument to be made in that novel that like she is the ghost. Like, she is. And it's like in the book, like the ghost or the presence seems to focus on her, but that makes sense because I think she is the haunting in her own way, because it's like the overwhelming sort of landscape of her emotion is so much that like the space becomes like a funhouse mirror that like reflects it back, and it just heightens it and makes it sort of crazed. And I just feel like that's so true. I mean, I think like also when you are like deep in the landscape of your own emotions, that is what it feels like, And so the idea that like the space could then sort of be occupied and then magnify that emotion just, again, like really makes sense to me. And I mean, it makes, I mean, I think it works for a lot of people, but I do think that like the tradition of the Gothic, the tradition of sort of women being mad in houses is just like such a just beautiful one, and one that just offers us so many ways of thinking about gender and the body and the domestic and like the way that we've thought about women sort of historically. And I don't know. It's just very exciting to me.
Hay otra cosa antes
There's something else in the beginning of the conversation. You were talking about Angela Carter, and there's something, I don't know if that happens to you here, to people here, but I feel certain rejection when reading classic stories or classic tales in current times, because it's like they insist on, forcing in an agenda which eventually takes substance out of the stories. It doesn't happen with Angela Carter because she's the master in reading classic tales and giving them a layer of depth and intensity, and it doesn't happen with me, with you, to me. I mean, all these stories which are dragged from tradition, these classic tales, reading them in a contemporary way, but without forcing them in a natural way, that feels really interesting. And I would like to know what your relationship like with this kind of story, and how do you work in that regard to bring it to the present?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I remember having this distinct realization as in my very late teens in college, reading various classic pieces of literature, which is that I remember reading I can't remember what book it was, and being like, oh, people were funny in the past. People could be funny. And I think the more that I've read, the more I've realized, oh, people in the past were funny and horny and make dirty jokes and and I think, if you read Shakespeare, that, all those things are in Shakespeare, right? So it's we have always sort of been essentially human beings are always the same, and I think once you sort of realize that, and that older texts, which I think to a certain kind of reader feel very inaccessible, but actually offer us this lens into the way in which humans have always been, right? But of course, sometimes stories need, or they don't need it, but they cry out for some kind of interrogation or some kind of turning over, I mean, I feel it's turning over a rock, and it's what's on, there's stuff under there, there's bugs and shit, I want to know what's in there. And so for me, the idea of retelling an existing story, or adapting it in some way, which obviously Angela Carter does, is just so, it just again feels like this just exciting. It's the way I feel excited about a haunted house story. It's I'm very excited by adaptation. And I mean, Angela Carter, The Bloody Chamber, is such again, another perfect book. And I remember the first time I read, not even the full book, but the story, The Bloody Chamber, which is a Bluebeard adaptation. And for a while I was reading a lot of Bluebeard adaptations and was so interested in the way that writers sort of tackle misogyny and tackle, cycles of domestic violence and tackle just all of these, or in The Bloody Chamber, the image of her mother at the end, the horse rearing and her mother coming in with the pistol and having shot him in between the eyes. It's just this way of sort of taking it, infusing with this new life and taking something and making it your own, which I think is I don't know, it's just a very human instinct to to reach back and be what does this have to show me? What do I have to show it? And also when you do that, you're also having conversations across time. I mean, Angela Carter, I never met her. She died right after I was born, but there's something about, and Angela Carter's adapting Bluebeard, and Bluebeard was written, centuries before she was born, and there's this way in which we're sort of having these conversations across time, and I think that's what makes adaptation so interesting to me, is it just offers us this space to have these time travel these seances with dead authors, where we get to say I see your humanity, let me show you mine, and I'm why would you not want to have a ghost seance with a dead author? Constantly. I do. That sounds great. And so, yeah, I just feel that to me, again, is just an area of just rich inquiry that I never get tired of it.
Hay una cosa que es una pregunta.
Now, there's something we've been wondering with journalist friends. It's we're in this time in which we are obsessed with stories, and it's we analyze everything focusing on the story, on the topic, so to speak. What's this book about? What is this book about? What is this movie about? And we miss the wealth and the richness in the books and the movies. In the movies, we just stop looking at the pictures and we just focus on the topic, if it's about motherhood or about loss or whatever. And I feel it's happening the same thing with books. And I'm to be blamed also as a journalist, because we focus so much on the actual topics. What is this book about? When your latest book was published, it is a book about abuse and the relationship between two girls. So that's a topic, and it looks like all the conversation is going to be around the topic, and you leave out the literature as such, the exercise of writing and the exercise of being able to tell a story which is approached from an autobiography in a certain way. And I always like to ask this to authors and filmmakers, are you not bothered by this? Like, you spent a lot of hours, a lot of work to write. I mean, writing is not just writing, but thinking, and there's a lot of work behind. And it's like this work is diluted, and it also prevents us from enjoying fully the works.
I mean, I think that's very astute and accurate. I mean, I have a similar concern, I think, with the way that, I mean, God forbid the word discourse, but like the conversations that happen around art right now feel like very weirdly literal and very reductive, and it does bother me tremendously. And I think people don't know, like, I think since people are struggling to understand like how to read something. I mean, this was I don't know how this conversation translated, but like the Cat Person conversation that happened in the US when Cat Person by Kristen Rapenian came out, and the story went, viral, and it was a short story in the New Yorker, but people would call it an essay, or they would call it a piece, or they would call it they would like assume that it was real because they didn't understand that like it was a short story, that it was in third person, it wasn't in first person. And there was just this like profound sort of, the word illiteracy is very strong, with this like way in which the reading, it was just so boiled down to these like very simple parts, but it's like this is like all working together as like a sort of single unit. And I don't really know what to do about that. Like, I actually do find it really distressing and strange. And I mean, to me, you can't untie, content and form. Like, you can't untangle like what a film is about from like the cinematography and the way that the film is shot, and like you can't untangle a book from its own sentences. Like the sentence is the thing that deepens it into this truth, right? Like I did a panel once years ago about the essay, and someone asked us like, what is a memoir? Like, what does that mean? And this other writer said, it means it's a piece of writing that is true down to the marrow of the sentence. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what it is, right? And I feel like that's in that sense that like you can't untangle these things because they are a single unit. And I think people try because it makes it easier to say like, well, that's a story about this, I don't care for that, or like, that's bad, or that's whatever. But like obviously it all kind of works together, and I don't know. I mean, I'm also very sort of bothered by it, and I don't really know what to do about it except just write my own work and just sort of like do what I'm going to do already. But yeah, no, it is very strange.
Contestando esto, planteas otra cosa que es otra.
And about that, there's another question I wanted to ask with it, which is related to the first person narration. How to understand the first person in literature as the absolute truth, and this is what happened to me, this is my story, there's no nuances, and then you identify the author with the text all the time, and this happens all the time. It's like thinking you are the character 100%, and that's quite violent for me too, because sometimes you interview authors, and it's true that with female authors, maybe they ask more complex questions because there's some topics we somehow limit to the female part, although it shouldn't be like that. And also I feel it's unfair. It's like you mistake the literary voice with the person.
Yeah, and I think this happens with any kind of, I'd say like marginalized artist. I think this is super common. So I think women, I think people of color, non-white people, queer people, like we assume like, oh, if you're a woman and your protagonist is a woman, then you're the protagonist, right? And I've seen this conversation play out in all these like very weird ways. I'll never forget, there was a friend of mine I went to school with, had a book come out, and I once heard a radio interview where the radio interviewer was assuming throughout the interview that all these stories that she'd written were like from her perspective, and she was like, none of these stories are, I mean, they're my stories, but like I was never like, I think one of them, she was like, I was never this person, like these are sort of works of the imagination, and yes, there are like pieces of me in the stories, but just true in general, but also like you can't assume that it's me. And I think also there's just something about, I feel like right now we're just in the middle of this crisis about the nature of fiction, like what fiction is and the role that it plays, specifically fiction, and I mean, I just feel like there's just like these conversations where people like don't know how to fully sort of like what does it mean to have a piece of writing that like isn't autobiographical, that is written by a person that might involve like pieces of other lives that they have sort of taken and like done what they want to do with, and like how do you like what's the word I'm looking for? Like how do you like pull truth out of that? Like what do you do with that? Because it is this very fundamentally strange, like what a strange thing that we like make up these stories and then read them, and then they inform something. They inform us about the world, or they inform us about ourselves, or they become these like access hatch to like human consciousness. Like what a bizarre sort of phenomenon. Like it's just like, it's very, very odd. And so I can understand why it would be sort of confusing to people, or why if that like people would have this like complicated relationship with the very nature of this like very strange thing that we do. But yeah, I think fiction is actually in a moment of crisis right now regarding what is it, what is the morality, responsibility of the author? Like, you know, there's just like all these questions that I think are like very like on right now that I find really fascinating.
Hay una cosa que...
So there's something, mainly when I interview authors working on horror or fantasy, and normally you're very young, it's like sometimes you are placed in the same package, in the same pack as like the other generation of fantasy or horror writers. But I feel there is, I don't like to use the concept generation, but I understand it might be awkward for you to be placed in the same, you know, in the same pigeonhole or in the same box, because you do different things, and of course you don't come out of the blue. And there's been women writing horror and fantasy throughout history, and it's been done from the beginning of time. But I do feel there is a new generation, although the tag generation is really ugly, but there's a new generation of female authors who are changing a generation of readers. You're being really important for them. I was quoting Enriquez or Samantha Schweblin, or your case, Liliana Colacho. I mean, you are opening, or you're making people change, and you're making them come closer to the genre in a different way and discover horror in a different way. And I like to approach that. I understand you don't like to be placed in a box, and you didn't come out of the blue, of course, and there's a long tradition before you. But I do feel that there was this coincidence in time of several interesting voices which are making a really significant contribution to the genre. In your case, it's not exclusively a horror literature, but you touch on it somehow. So it's just my impression, but I wanted to ask you about that, if you feel connected to other authors working currently on similar materials to yours.
Yeah, you know, I think there's this has come up. I feel like people ask me sort of variations on this question a lot, and I think about it a lot, because I think in the beginning I wasn't quite sure what to make of that phenomenon, like what to make of this idea. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of it, or at least my theory anyway, has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, I feel like historically there has been this sort of, at least I should say in like American literature, there's like sort of this divide between sort of genre fiction and like literary fiction. And we use these terms, and there's been a lot of sort of hostility and anxiety around these categories and around the sort of the work that has sort of emerged sort of around these categories. And so as a result, there's like these sort of like, in the United States, there's like these sort of distinct tracks of literature, and like writers will sort of kind of go down one or the other, and occasionally there'll be sort of crossover authors. So like, you know, like Jeff Vandermeer, like he's an author who, you know, he started off in the genre space, but then he published the Southern Reach trilogy with like a literary publisher in the US, and then he sort of gained this like crossover sort of appeal. So I mean, there's just this like and I think what's happening right now is that there's this new sort of wave of writers who are sort of writing whatever they want and not pinning themselves, not like sort of putting a flag and like team this or team that. They're just like, here's the thing I wrote. you can read it or not read it, I don't care, right? And so there's something about like that act of just not acknowledging this like fight or this weird thing that's happening and just being like, you know, literature is literature. Like it's all working together. If you try to like put it into categories, you're just gonna deny yourself, you know, the pleasure of getting to know all the work that's sort of happening in the world. And so there's just, we're just like in this really beautiful moment of, I think, like writers emerging, in this way where they're like, and they're just like creating work that just feels so, I want to say like, almost like genre promiscuous, which is a way that I've described my own work before. Like there's something where it's like, it's all fun, it's all, bring it all in, you know, it's like, whatever, who cares, right? Like there's no sort of sense of prudishness about, you know, what you can or can't do. There's just this like, you know, excitement about worlds and excitement about subverting these rules and also an obsessive love of like a good sentence, right? And like, honestly, when you have those things, you can literally do whatever you want. Like you know, that is like, to me, I'm like, that's it, that's all I need, you know, is like that level of like curiosity and like interest in sort of the human condition through these modes of telling and like loving a good sentence. And like, that is, it's perfect, right? Like what else, you know, what else could you possibly ask from a book? So.
Antes,
And also, coming close to home, I was telling you about the movies. I was saying that your books sounded very much like a movie, like they were very cinematographical. So I was thinking, do you think about movies when you write a book? There's some references in your book when you talk about queer villains, and you quote the unknown in the lake. And I love the way you introduce this rare movie. It's not a frequent movie in books, the way you bring it in. So is there any cinema references in your literature?
Yeah, I mean, I love movies. I have always have. And I think that for me, you know, it's in the same way, like it offers us a way to sort of, or a way for me to think about what my work can do. So like the story in my first collection, Inventory, which is a pandemic story that I wrote before COVID, you know, I remember writing that book and thinking a lot about the film Children of Men, which is one of my favorite movies and is right and does so much work with foregrounding and backgrounding, like the world building that's happening kind of in the background and then the characters, and there's just this interesting sort of movement between that I've always found very interesting. And so when I wrote Inventory, you know, I wanted to write about a woman who is, you know, just sort of navigating and negotiating sex and her body and like, you know, her lovers and just trying to sort of figure out who she is. But in the background, there's this huge pandemic that's like slowly kind of creeping across the country and killing all these people. And so, you know, that to me, but like I was thinking sort of cinematically in that way, because I was thinking about this idea, or like how when you watch a movie, you know, when you read a book, you read it or you don't read it, but like you read the text that's on the book. But like if you're watching a movie, your eye can kind of go anywhere it wants to go on the screen. And like, I find that really interesting. And I'm like, how can you reproduce that effect in prose? Or can you? I'm not sure, but like, how can I try, you know? And I'm just like interested in the ways that like those sort of forms like offer things to each other. And so, sorry, I've actually forgotten your original question. I forgot what you were asking. I got so excited about movies. But yes, I do love movies, and I think that, you know, there's just, I mean, I love, I mean, you know, the movies that I cite and I write about, you know, in the Dream House, like are movies that, you know, watching them during this time when I was writing the book, like spoke to some piece of the story that you know, and affected me in this certain way. But yeah, no, I don't know. I feel like there's just so much that they offer us, and I really love them.
Hay una pregunta antes de, igual podemos.
So maybe we can leave 5 or 10 minutes for questions from the audience, but I wanted to, you know, snuggle in and to sneak in a question. Maybe it's out of order now because I wanted to ask it before, but It's about female characters, not white female characters, because I love them like this, and it's obvious. There's been too many male characters, and we need female characters. But there's something I love, even when they're going through hard times because bad things are done to them. You never take them as victims. You never observe them as victims, even when bad things happen to them. They are ambiguous characters, and even from the victim position, they can have good ideas or bad ideas, but there's no victimization of a character, which in any other story would be the irrefutable victim. So I would like you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so funny. I did an interview earlier today, and they were also asking me about victims, and I've been thinking about this idea of victimhood and what that means and what we, I think that we've just sort of, I think there was just this idea, like, I think we want, like, we being just like society, like, people find comfort in victimhood because it sort of, in the way that it sort of assigns blame and it assigns, like a pass, like an emotional pass to like the person who is the victim. And I think that we are very invested because it makes things sort of emotionally very simple, right? It's like there's a perpetrator, there's a victim, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, if you've ever worked in any kind of like, any kind of crime advocacy or like, with victims of sexual violence, like, there's no such thing as a perfect victim, right? People don't act perfectly. People do what they're going to do. Like, again, we're returning to this idea of humanity. Like, people will act in these human ways. And I find that way more interesting than any sort of simple sort of category that you could put, which is also why I find like sort of the idea, I mean, people have talked about, this idea of like the strong female character, and it's like, I don't find that interesting either, because I'm like, that's not interesting. That's very reductive, it's very flat. To me, I'm interested in human beings and all their complexities and like the things that they do that are like beautiful and fucked up and horrifying and terrifying and sad and lovely, and like, I'm interested in like these complexities and these details, and to me that is just, I mean, that's the human experience, and that's what makes me able to like, I mean, I love people. I mean, one of the hardest things about COVID is like not that, is like not getting to meet people and not getting to sort of see humanity like playing out in this like really, in this way, and like I've been missing that piece of getting to see human beings as they are, and yeah, I don't know. And to me, that is the most. So I'm like, why forget like strong female characters? Forget, victims. Like, I'm just interested in women as people. I mean, people as people also, but women as people especially.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta.
I don't know if there's any question from the floor.
Pues que no veo nada. Sí. Vale, gracias.
Hello. I would like to ask you, seeing as this is a literature festival, it would be mostly about books, but you can throw some movies in there as well if you want. I would like you to recommend us some horror books that almost made you shit your pants.
That almost Oh man, that's a great prompt. Let's see. Well, I will tell you that a horror novel that really upset me, that I feel like a lot of people have not read, I also don't know if it's translated into Spanish, so I apologize in advance. There's this novel called The House Next Door by, oh my God, what is her name? Anne Rivers Seddons. It's a Southern Gothic novel from the 70s, and it's about a couple who, it's just this like terrible couple who these rich, they just like work fancy jobs and like do cocaine and like fuck all day. Like they just drinking like pitchers of martinis. They're just horrible people, really insufferable. But there's this married couple, and there is a house getting built behind them, like a brand new, like modern house. And something is very wrong with the house. And I read it in some list, like I think I read something like Stephen King was like, it's one of the scariest books he'd ever read, and I had never heard of it. And it's actually interesting because she is not a horror writer, like she is a writer of like Southern sort of novels, like in the US, and this book is just utterly, just really upset. I mean, so upsetting. Like, and I was so upset reading it, and I feel like I've read a bunch of books like that like in the last couple of years. There's also The Elementals by, oh my God, what is his name? I can't remember the author's name, which is also just like very, very creepy. Both of those are just, yeah, I love a good, I just read, oh my God, who wrote Hellraiser? That's, thank you, Clive Barker, thank you. I just read his, is it Books of Blood? Which was like incredible. And like there was In the Mountains, the Cities, which is like this short story that also was just like so distressing and strange. Like I really love, I feel like there was this era, like the 70s and 80s, I feel like there's some just like banger, like horror novels and stories that are just like deeply, deeply upsetting. I also saw Hellraiser for the first time recently, the film, and I fucking loved it. And was just like, this is insane. No one would ever, this I don't know how this movie got made or like how this book got, or how this short story got written. Like it's just completely nuts and I love it. But yeah, I'd say The House, if you're looking for just like a really surprising and upsetting book you probably have not read, it's The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Suttons.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hello. I'd like to ask you about orality, verbality, because the first short story I read from you about the husband, I can't remember the title, but you start saying, if you will read out this tale, and you give a series of instructions as to how to read it. And I thought that was brilliant to begin with, and I really got trapped in your writing. I'd like to know whether you see how to go back to these reading out or telling stories out loud among adult readers. I think that in some interview with you, I read that you remembered very fondly the feeling of being read out horror stories when in camp, and this amazing feeling of having fun but being upset. It's just a reading. You don't need any image like in cinema, just with the support of a reading. And I'd like to know, what do you think about this?
So I think the Spanish title is different, but it's The Husband's Stitch in English. I don't know, is that the same? But yeah, so in that story, I'm adapting a couple of urban legends that, in my case, came from this book. It's called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which was a book that I read when I was a small child. It was like folk tales and urban legends adapted for children. And in this book, there were instructions for reading the stories out loud. And I remember, I think the story that you probably heard, I probably have said in like a million interviews, is I was a Girl Scout and I went to camp, and I didn't really like the other Girl Scouts. They didn't really like me. And I was a very weird child. So like, I think I was kind of off-putting, and they just, but I remember telling a story. And I remember in the story, like in the book, it said, like it's the woman whose liver, it's not her liver. She takes a liver from a corpse to feed to her husband. And then that night the corpse comes looking for its liver, and it says, "Who has my liver?" And so there's like this sort of build up, and the corpse is looking, and she's hiding in the blankets. And then what you're supposed to do is say, is grab somebody and say, "You have it," at the end of the story. And I did it to a girl in my troop, and she cried. She screamed and then she cried, and I was in big trouble. But I was like, wow. I was like, yeah, that was great. Like that was like to be able to like provoke an emotional reaction from somebody that way was like very funny and interesting to me. And I think that there is something. I mean, again, speaking of like, borrowing from other forms, and so in this case, it's like almost borrowing from like theater or borrowing from, right, like this sort of oral tradition where it's like the story is written down, you obviously can just read it in your head, but like, there's a pleasure to like having these instructions. And sometimes the instructions get kind of strange. And it's funny, there's a line in that story where it says, move the curtain, like go to your nearest window and open the curtain. It'll be raining, I promise. And I cannot tell you how many people have written to me, dozens of people, saying, I was reading the story and I opened the curtain and it was raining, and it was very upsetting, so there was just something to me about this, like, again, this kind of formal play, like this idea of being able to like, kind of like I'm reaching out and like slapping you a little bit, but it's good, you like it, so I feel like that is sort of the energy that I want to bring to those stories. Yeah.
Hola, buenas. Quería preguntar.
Hello, I'd like to ask you regarding what Desiree asked you about this phenomenon of separating the literary act from the topic, because in your stories, style is closely linked with what you want to tell. And in your short stories collection, style changes notably among stories. So I'd like to ask you about this process of looking for this quest for your literary voice for each thing that you want to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, for me, every story sort of offers up its own, I guess, its capacity for like formal play or style. And every story is a little different. And I think, and sometimes it just doesn't work. So I have a lot of stories that are like abandoned experiments where I tried to tell a story in a certain form and it just didn't work, or it wasn't like catching the way that I wanted it to. And I was like, this is just, whereas like with the memoir, like it was only when I figured out the formal organization of the book that the whole book kind of felt possible. Whereas before that I had just been like writing like dreadful sentences and it was just like, oh, this is so boring. No one's gonna want to read this. This is awful. And it was only when I figured out the form that like the whole thing kind of came together. And so I feel like in the short story collection, what you're seeing is almost that level of like experimentation. It's like a laboratory. It's like, it's like you're seeing it kind of on a story to story basis, which is actually why I love short stories specifically, and I really love, because I love getting to see writers like grappling with these relationships sort of, again, like story to story as opposed to like an entire novel, like an entire like single book. And so, yeah, to me it's such an exciting process. And I think that, and then when it works, like when the style and the form and the genre and the story all come together, the result is just so exciting, and I feel like, and I can feel it. Like when I'm writing, I can sort of feel. It's like the fire catching. Like it's like oh, there's something happening here that's like working in this way, and everything is sort of speaking to everything else, and like the sentence, everything is just working together. Like it's it's like little pieces of a machine. So yeah, so I feel like for me that is the thing that I'm looking for as a writer. I mean, as a reader also, but like, when I'm writing, it's like, that's the effect that I'm looking for.
No sé si había una última.
Is there one last question? Apart from the translated works, you have written comic works, right? Are you as familiar with comic as with cinema? And what does this format of comic contribute to your storytelling? No, sorry, as a comic book. Yeah, graphic novel, sorry.
It's okay.
My fault.
No, it's okay. Yes, I have written a comic book, a graphic novel, a graphic project. Yeah, it's actually very similar to writing a screenplay, like in the sense that it's sort of like a hybrid of the two. Like I did have to write a script. I had to think visually. Like I remember the editor saying to me like, oh, like if you have like a surprise, like a visual, like I had a monster that appeared and he was like, make sure it's on the odd page because you want to like turn the page and see the monster. You don't want the monster to be on the page on the right and then you'll just know it's coming. So like there was like visual things that I had to think of that I had not thought of before. So yeah, so it's like similar in some way, but it was also it's own sort of thing, and it was a new way I had to learn how to write. But thank you.
Hay una cosa muy bonita que ha pasado y
There's a beautiful thing that has happened, that someone asked a question, who is the artist of your books in Spanish, Carmen Segovia, who is the illustrator, the author of the front pages of your books in Spanish. I didn't see it was her, but I just texted her, and yes, it was her. And they are so beautiful that I was excited to break this to all of you. Carmen, you should have introduced yourself. A big round of applause for Carmen. And of course,
amazing, yes. Y por supuesto otro fuerte.
And obviously a big round of applause for you, Carmen. Thank you. Just one more thing. Carmen will be signing books if you feel like spending some time with her. Thank you very much. And thanks to the festival for organizing such an event. Thank you.